There are many stars in the firmament of history that get written about, but the ones that don't blaze like comets and disappear without a trace into the black holes of time. The story of India's freedom struggle opens up a virtual galaxy of events and characters that whirled in different orbits around a singular purpose: to be free. It is only when you join the dots that a picture emerges. It's time to discover how India's ancient past and present-day independence is inextricably linked to a few isolated dots almost falling off the map at the edge of the Indian Ocean. According to a legend in the Hindu epic Ramayana, the monkey god Hanuman used the Andaman Islands as a stepping stone as he flew across the seas to Lanka to rescue Sita. The Malays call it Andaman, from which its present name is said to have been derived. Stories from the Ramayana have been carried by traders and seafarers from the Indian coastline to the far shores of Southeast Asia. The Cholas of Tamil Nadu, who sailed to Southeast Asia,
subscribe now
often stopped by
and
these
press the
islands
bell icon.
en route.
Never miss an
The
update.
Tanjo inscription of 1050 mentions Nicobaram, or the land of the naked. A culvert built by the Tamils can still be seen in Nicobar, a Portuguese corruption of the Tamil name. For centuries, these islands that form an arching broken chain between 6 degrees and 14 degrees north latitude and 92 degrees and 94 degrees east longitude remain cut off from the mainstream of history except for a few passing references by foreign travelers. After failed evangelical missions and attempts at colonization by the Danes, the Austrians, the French and the Portuguese, it was the turn of the British, the most successful of all colonial powers. Port Blair, the capital of the Andaman Islands, is the only port of entry and the first stop for any traveler. With its delicious tropical climate and cosmopolitan population, this lively town holds the key to one of the most important chapters in Indian history. The most prominent symbol of Britain's colonial domination and India's undaunted revolutionary spirit is the cellular jail. Prior to the construction of the cellular jail, prisoners were housed in the nearby islands of Chatham, Ross and Viper. However, the number of prisoners in the Andamans had gone up from a few hundred in 1858 to 12,000 at the end of the 19th century. In 1890, a two-member committee suggested the construction of a new jail at Port Blair to impart solitary confinement on the lines of the Kannur jail in Kerala. Atlanta Point Hilltop close to Aberdeen Bazaar was considered an ideal site. From 1893, hundreds of prisoners worked night and day for over 10 years to build this massive brick and concrete jail. Nearly 30 million bricks made out of broken corals from Dundas Point and Navy Bay Kiln were used in its construction. Instead of cement, a unique mix of jaggery and lime called surki was used as binders. The most astounding aspect was its architectural design and scale. The edifice extended in all directions of the hillock like an octopus, with 7 wings spreading out like tentacles from a central tower. Each wing had 3 stories with cells arranged in a row along a lengthy corridor. The prison housed 693 individual cells for solitary confinement, hence the name cellular jail. Each prison cell measured 13.6 feet by 7.6 feet with a narrow cot of 1.5 feet. Needless to say, the amenities provided to captives were less than basic. The room was bare, except for an iron utensil used for food, which often rusted and led to food poisoning. A single mug of water was provided each day. The only opening in the cell was a tiny window to the rear measuring 3 foot by 1 foot for ventilation. The rear of one wing faced the rear of another, separated by a wall in between, making it impossible to know who was coming or going. The first room on each floor was larger and served as the guard room, while another sentry manned the central watchtower. The cellular jail became the venue where captured Indian revolutionaries braced themselves for the full impact of British scourge. Notorious jailer David Barry called the 6 months mandatory confinement at the cellular jail the taming of the lions. After this torture, lesser convicts were moved to other jails for 18 months of less strenuous tasks under supervision, while the hardcore nationalists continued their term here. The most important phase in the jail was between 1909 and 1921, while the second phase lasted from 1932 to 1938. Revolutionaries who played a key part in the Alipur conspiracy case, the Nasik conspiracy case, First Lahore conspiracy case, Chittagong Armory raid case, Interprovincial conspiracy case, Banaras conspiracy case, besides the Rampa revolt of Godavari and the Mapla rebellion of Malabar, were transported from all over India. Every prisoner had a metal identification plate around his neck that stated the order and act number under which he had been imprisoned. The convicts were kept in chains and handcuffs according to their crimes, using chain, bar, and cross fetters. Each wing had a workshop for rigorous labor. Their main tasks were removal of coconut husk, soaking it in water, beating it to make coir, and using a hand-operated machine to make ropes and gunny bags. Each prisoner had to generate 6 kilos of coir every day or operate the kolu or oil grinding machine to extract 30 pounds of coconut oil by evening. The simplicity of this small building belies the severity of its purpose. These were the gallows. Prisoners often carried out their own last rites before walking the last few steps of their lives. Behind these green doors they were hanged, usually 3 at a time. As the siren on the central watchtower sounded horn, boats near the harbour would know the cellular jail had claimed 3 more lives. Evidently, the strict punishment and harsh conditions led the Andaman exile across the dark waters to gain the notorious appellation of Saza-e Kalapani, punishment to the black waters. This is North Bay, and over there is Ross Island. The splendid view from this vantage point of the cellular jail reassures that past and present were 2 sides of the same coin. Indu Bhushan Roy, Baba Bhan Singh, Ram Rakha, Hoti Lal Verma, Babu Ram Hoti, Pandit Parmanand, Ulhaskar Dutt, Barinder Kumar Ghosh, Trilokanath Chakrabarti, Sushil Das Gupta, Vishwanath Mathur. The names of all freedom fighters incarcerated at the cellular jail are engraved in white marble plates in the central tower of the jail. The most famous inmate at cellular jail was Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Imprisoned here between 1911 and 1921, he was locked up in a double-gated cell facing the gallows. Ironically, his younger brother, Ganesh Damodar Savarkar, was also in the same jail, but it took Savarkar 2 years to realize it. It was on the walls of this very cell that Savarkar began etching the first verses of what would be a 300-page poem called Kamala Kavya. Savarkar lived to see a free India, and the airport at Port Blair was named in his memory, as was the Martyr Park in front of the jail. The harsh living conditions of the jail led to mass hunger strikes between 1932 and 1937. Mahabir Singh, a convict of the Lahore conspiracy case and an associate of Bhagat Singh, was the first victim of brutal force feeding by the British, followed by Mohan Kishore Namdas and Mohit Moitra. Their statues stand in open defiance, facing the very jail that claimed their lives. The last strike was terminated on the intervention of Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore under pressure. The British government decided to close down the penal settlement. By January 1938, the cellular jail was completely emptied of its inmates who were sent back to the mainland. However, history was not done with the Andamans yet. It was soon to play a crucial part in a global event. The onset of World War II in 1939 added another grim chapter in the history of the Andaman Islands. Britain's involvement in the global theatre of war loosened its grip on its far-flung colonies. The Japanese occupied Singapore, and by January 1942, Rangoon was the next to fall. On 23 March 1942, Japanese troops landed on Port Blair Harbour and captured it without firing a single shot. The 3-year period of Japanese occupation till 7th October 1945 was a tragic one. Innocent, educated islanders who were members of the Indian Independence League and INA were tortured mercilessly on charges of espionage, and dreaded doors of cellular jail were opened once more for Indian prisoners. During the Japanese occupation, Port Blair played host to another famous visitor, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, Supreme Commander of the Provisional Government of Azad Hind. He visited the cellular jail and was welcomed by Admiral Ishikawa. On 30th December 1943, Netaji hoisted the Indian tricolour in the British Free Indian Territory for the first time near the present Netaji Stadium. A memorial commemorating the first flag hoisting was erected near Netaji Stadium in Port Blair. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands were renamed Shahid Dweep, Martyr Island, and Swaraj Dweep, Self-Rule Island respectively. However, Netaji was deliberately kept away from the imprisoned Indians and stories of Japanese torture. Meanwhile, British forces based in Sri Lanka exerted pressure on Japan through frequent raids. Village and tribal headmen passed on strategic information about Japanese locations to British submarines. The precision bombings by Allied forces sank many Japanese ships, triggering indiscriminate arrests on the ground. The acute food shortage caused by the British blockade forced the Japanese to take extreme measures. According to survivor Saudagar Singh, 700 innocent people were taken in 3 big boats and were thrown overboard near Havelock Island in the dead of the night, while 7 people were shot dead at Dagnabad. Just off the road to Wandoor lies this abandoned park on a small hillock at Humphrey Gunj. On 30th January 1944, 44 innocent people who were detained at cellular jail on false spy charges were brought here and brutally murdered. The trench where they were buried is marked by a memorial. However, the tide was about to turn. In retaliation to the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, America dropped atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender. After the ceremonial handing over by the Japanese force on 7th October 1945, the British immediately closed the penal settlement. Their reoccupation lasted only 2 years because in 1947, India was set free. Today, the cellular jail is a ghost of its former self. Its 4 wings damaged due to calamity and war. A few chambers in the jail's administrative block display archival material and images collected from the families of political freedom fighters. After repeated efforts, of the ex-Andaman political prisoners fraternity circle, the cellular jail was declared a national monument on 11th February 1979, and a martyrs column was erected in honor of the patriots incarcerated here. Every evening at the twilight hour, voices ring out in a poignant sound and light show, while an eternal flame glows to reaffirm the spirit of liberty that shone from a faraway island. There are several sites in the Andamans that help one piece together the main events surrounding Indian independence. Let's travel back in time to the different landmarks that marked the key phases of British colonial rule, like Viper Island, Mount Harriet, Ross Island and Chatham. In 1777, John Ritchie undertook a survey of the Bay of Bengal and urged Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, to take greater interest in these islands. A decade later, Lord Cornwallis commissioned Lieutenant Archibald Blair to explore the Andaman Islands and find a suitable location for a harbour. In 1788, Blair, assisted by Lieutenant Robert Hyde Colebrook of the Bengal Engineers, set sail from Calcutta with two ships under his command, the Elizabeth and Viper. An excellent marine surveyor, Blair presented a detailed report of the water, soil, wind, currents, climate, natural resources, and flora, fauna. Besides being the first organized expedition of the Andamans, this was also the first trustworthy account of the island and its original inhabitants. Thanks to Blair, many of the unnamed islands of the Andamans were given their first names. Chatham was named after an area in Kent, Viper Island took the name of Blair's ship, while Ross was a tribute to the marine surveyor Daniel Ross. Chatham Island is the stage where it all started way back on a September day in 1789, when Lieutenant Blair and Colebrook returned to the Andamans with soldiers, artisans, laborers, and two Chinese gardeners. The Union Jack was hoisted for the first time to mark the earliest British base in the Andamans. Blair chose the natural harbour opposite Chatham as the site for Port Cornwallis. It's quite amazing that the wooden wharf built at Chatham to land naval stores exists even to this day. Rampant deaths due to malaria and the fierce monsoons forced the British to abandon the settlement in May 1796, and the Andamans had to face a lull that lasted 6 decades. The spark for resettling the islands was in some ways connected to a strange event: the coincidental shipwreck of two ships sailing to Calcutta from two ends of the earth, the Runnymede, which was sailing from Gravesend, and the Briton sailing from Sydney. On November 11, 1844, the two British military ships got caught in the same cyclone over the Andaman Sea and were shipwrecked within a mile of each other at Sir John Lawrence Island near Havelock. The story of their dramatic survival after a 55-day ordeal and subsequent shipwrecks of the Flying Fish and Emily prompted the British to take serious note of the Andamans once again. If the decision to resettle the islands was ignited by an accident, what accelerated it was an event that rocked the very foundations of British rule in India. In 1857, the Indian Sepoy Mutiny, or the First War of Indian Independence, raged like an inferno on the mainland. The British found it hard to quell the tidal wave of nationalism. With prisons on the mainland packed to capacity, they were posed with a peculiar problem: where to jail the thousands of mutineers and conspirators. Imprisoning them with regular convicts was fraught with danger. Cut off from the mainland by seas all around, a natural prison almost impossible to escape from, home to hostile tribes, these Virgin Islands fit the bill. The Andaman Committee advised the setting up of a penal settlement on the lines of existing ones in the Far East, where Indian prisoners had been sent in the past. In January 1858, Captain Henry Mann was sent to establish a penal settlement that would transform the Andamans into India's Alcatraz. Archibald Blair's original choice of harbour, Port Cornwallis, was renamed as Port Blair, and Mann hoisted the British flag in the name of Her Majesty the Queen, thereby inking a blood-stained chapter in the saga of these islands. Today, a memorial at Chatham commemorates the historic landing of these pioneer freedom fighters of India's First War of Independence. The Chatham Sawmill, the largest and oldest sawmill in Asia, is another landmark that functions even today. The museum nearby is a great place to trace the early years. However, acute water scarcity prompted the British to shift base to Ross Island nearby. See the red buildings emblazoned with Ross. That's where the ruins of the erstwhile headquarters of the British administration, now maintained by the Indian Navy. Spread over nearly 1 square kilometer, Ross is the smallest island in the Andamans, yet it served as a British base for over 80 years, often described as the Paris of the East. It is hard to imagine how Ross enjoyed an enviable reputation as a fashionable settlement for English officers, but archival pictures gives us glimpses of Ross in its heyday. The famous high tea parties that took place on these very lawns exemplified the English way of life and their love for tea and elegant crockery. This beautiful bakery churned out endless trays of oven-fresh cakes, muffins and bakes. Visitors to Ross can easily identify the original structures in their use thanks to the legible signboards put up by the Navy. These are corroded rusty remains of the boiler and powerhouse that once generated electricity through steam. The British also put up a printing press, post office, tennis courts and a swimming pool for the officers and the families to take a dip. The island was divided into 2 halves by a wall running east to west. The barracks of the European soldiers was on the hilltop north of the wall, while the convicts remained to the south. The officers' mess on the seaside and Chief Commissioner's bungalow on the hilltop were supposedly 2 of the most elegantly designed structures on the island. But this veritable paradise was hand-built with the blood, sweat and tears of freedom fighters. Several political captives died in the process of clearing forests and constructing buildings that befitted a colonial town. It is said nearly half the prisoners died in the first 3 years of the establishment of the penal settlement. The British also met resistance from the Aborigines. 3 major skirmishes between April and May 1859 culminated in the famous Battle of Aberdeen, where Aborigines attacked the Aberdeen settlement. A memorial commemorating the event still stands by the jetty at Port Blair. Records maintained at the Smithika Museum at Ross Island give more details about the island's history. A short hike up this road takes you to the Presbyterian Church, a graceful piece of architecture with a tranquil, poetic ambience. Its arched windows were once fitted with stained glass that cast prismatic beams of light. The inner wall, where a church bell was hung, is now enmeshed by banyan roots. Further up is the cemetery with slabs of stone portraying telltale signs of grief and loss. A path leads you to the rugged Ferrar beach. Shorn of its former glory, virtually deplumed by time, Ross is no longer the exquisite tropical bird preening its feathers. Today, it bears faint resemblance to those black and white pictures. its broken buildings are ensnared in a web of roots and vines. Perhaps a symbolic representation of how the roles have reversed, these edifices of British power and oppression now struggle to free themselves from the vice-like grip of nature, imprisoned for eternity. The penal settlement established by the British soon outgrew its needs. With few guards and high casualties due to malaria, pneumonia, and torture, the British decided to set up a first-ever separate prison on an island on the other side of the harbour. The British occupied this island in 1859 and named it Viper Island after Blair's famous ship. The first jail on the Andaman Islands was constructed here in 1864. Notorious chain gangs of convicts were kept in large enclosures, and a red brick dome at the highest point of the island served as the gallows. It was here that rebels were hanged from a noose wrapped around the strong wooden beam. It has withstood the test of time over 150 years. The most famous convict to be hanged here was a Pathan called Sher Ali, whose victim was a prize catch. Perhaps the most important man in British India, the Viceroy of India, Lord Mayo. On 8th February, he went to Mount Harriet, the highest point in the South Andamans, to savor the spectacular sunset. It was dark by the time he reached the Hopetown jetty for the ferry back to Ross. Lord Mayo was ambushed and assassinated by Sher Ali. It was the sacrifice and countless revolutionaries and unsung heroes that helped India gain independence. But freedom was accompanied by the pain of partition, the creation of India along with East and West Pakistan. When the Bangladesh Liberation War broke out in 1971, the Indian government decided to use the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to rehabilitate displaced refugees. Special reserve forests and islands were designated as tribal zones to protect the cultural identity of local tribes in the Andamans from the influx of outsiders. People trickled in from Bengal and other coastal regions like Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. Today, the archipelago dons a distinct character of cultural diversity, and its matchless beauty beckons travelers from across the world to explore its wild waters and pristine beaches. A visit to the Andaman Islands is an attempt to join the dots connecting India's freedom struggle and also a journey of self-discovery. An exploration of the potential of individual men with power, tolerance, and guts to change the face of history.